Hi, everyone. We're live, right? um, Welcome to the Secular Cults panel at FtBCon3. I'm really excited to be here presenting with Adam Lee, who's a blogger at Patheos under Daylight Atheism, and Karen Stollznow. I'm not going to be able to do detailed introductions for everybody. So if you would like to say a few words about yourself, I've also got Karen Stollznow, Vyckie Garrison, and Angie Jackson will be joining us shortly, I believe. So you guys want to just give a brief introduction?
Well, my name's Dr. Karen Stollznow, and I'm a linguist. I'm an author as well. I've written, excuse me, a number of books, including Language, Myths, Mysteries, and Magic. That's my latest book, and also Haunting America, and God Bless America, which is a book about strange minority religious beliefs and practices in the United States, which is why I think I've been invited on this panel today. I've got a chapter on New Age spirituality. I'll be talking about that a bit today.
Adam?
Sure. Thanks, Russell. I'm Adam Lee. I write the blog Daylight Atheism on Patheos, as was previously indicated. And for the past 2 years, I've been doing a chapter-by-chapter review of Ayn Rand's doorstop-sized novel Atlas Shrugged. And tonight I'm planning to speak about Rand, her biography, her philosophy, which she called Objectivism, and why it was, in the words of one critic I won't name, the unlikeliest cult.
Vyckie?
I'm Vyckie Garrison. I started the blog No Longer Quivering, where I was talking about my escape from the Quiverful movement, which is definitely a cultic kind of very extreme fundamentalist Christianity. And I am going to be talking about homeschooling and also just about the cult dynamic and some of my experience with that.
Okay, cool. I think we lost some of your sound at the end, but I'm Russell Glasser. I'm a software engineer in Austin. I have not written any books, and I don't do atheism professionally, but for about, I don't know, over 10 years, I've been the host of a show called The Atheist Experience, a host of the show, and have clocked a lot of time dealing one-on-one with arguments from various religions. But one of my first loves when I discovered the internet all the way back in the mid-90s was getting into this. Like, one of the first things I got into was financial scams. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experiences with Amway and other multi-level marketing groups. But before we get into that, and I hope Angie will come back soon because I was hoping that she could weigh in on the topic in the beginning. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is a cult as we understand it, and we can have a little bit of discussion about that. So I'm going to start with the most cheesy and lazy of approaches, which is, of course, to read the Wikipedia page. Wikipedia says that a cult is a religious or social group with socially deviant or novel beliefs and practices. However, whether any group's particular beliefs and practices are sufficiently deviant or novel is often unclear, thus making a precise definition problematic. The word cult is controversial because it is considered a subjective term, often used as an ad hominem attack against groups with differing doctrines or practices, which lacks a clear or consistent definition. I have a list that I pulled up of classic characteristics of a cult. But the problem with researching this kind of thing is that in a lot of cases, the groups that are accusing other groups of being cults are mainstream religions, which you might argue, I mean, fundamentalist Christians seem to have an awful lot of anti-cult groups going under the name of things like the American Family Foundation, and it seems like they generally just kind of resent the competition. But it's hard to come up with a really concrete definition of a cult. But what seems kind of common to people who try to describe it are a few characteristics like these. In these groups, questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged or punished. Mind-altering practices such as meditation, chanting, speaking in tongues, denunciation sessions, and debilitating work routines are used in excess and serve to suppress doubts about the group and its leader. The leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, act, and feel. The group has a polarized us versus them mentality, which may cause conflict with the wider society. And the leader is not accountable to any authorities, and members are encouraged or required to live and or socialize only with other group members. That's coming from a group called ICSA, which stands for International Cultic Studies Association. So how about we discuss those points first before moving on? Oh, Angie's back. Good.
I had to switch computers. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us. You want to give a brief introduction before we talk some more?
Sure. I'm Angie the Anti-Theist, blogger. I also have a makeup blog at facearmor.tumblr.com. I was born and raised in a faith healing cult started by my grandmother. It was more of a traditional cult atmosphere, lots of homeschooling, lots of real insular community. People were very much discouraged from reading outside information, things like that.
So you're actually kind of the only person here who's really talking mainly about actual literal cults. Well, except for maybe Vyckie.
Yeah, I think Vyckie was in a pretty similar one.
Yeah, so what's your take on the distinction between a cult and a mainstream religion? Because I know that we have a big atheist audience, and a lot of them would be inclined to say, oh, well, you know, they're all really cults.
I would say that a cult is usually very high demand, that what it requires of its members goes above and beyond, you know, the typical sacrifices of a small tithe and an hour or two a week for a service. Cults generally, whether secular or religious, are going to require a lot more time, energy, and money of their cult members. They're going to make more specific edicts regarding how cult members raise their children, organize their marital life, things of that nature.
Okay. Any other comments on that topic?
I think, generally speaking, cults are abusive, and people who are survivors of cults have a more painful experience with that than necessarily an atheist who left a mainstream religion behind but did not suffer the consequences of excommunication or shunning or things like that.
Let me see. Well, okay. So you said you grew up in a cult originally.
Yes.
How did you get out?
Well, in my case, it was kind of facilitated by my grandmother's declining health and progression of Alzheimer's. So she was less on top of running things for a while, and I, as a concerned granddaughter, pressured her into getting a hip replacement surgery and some other medical care that she had been putting off for a very long time as a faith healer. And that pretty much ended it, because you can't go in for hip replacement surgery and continue being a faith healer afterwards. So So it was actually a couple years after that that I realized it was a cult when studying an 1840s American cult called the Oneida Utopia. Everyone else in my history class thought it was weird. I thought it sounded oddly familiar, and then did a Google search for my grandmother's name, Carol Balizet, and discovered she was a cult leader. That was pretty much the consensus.
Wow.
Aren't the silverware people? They make the cutlery?
Yes, Oneida Silverware Company is actually owned by the descendants of the original cult, which actually is the only cult I know of that equitably divided their assets upon dissolution so that everyone ended up at least middle class at the end of it. Very rare for a cult.
Would it be fair to say that under the definitions and characteristics we've been using, that the line between a cult and a religion is kind of a gray area, at least? Because I mean, I feel like some religious groups are little more than social clubs, but then you said that that cults are a lot more demanding of your time and money, and there certainly are some fundamentalist sects where members feel inclined to go to church like many times a week and donate a lot of their money to the cause.
I think that investment, personal investment of your time, your energy, your money, it really creates kind of this very powerful head trip that's going on. And it is a different, it's almost like, I remember when I finally kind of woke up to what was going on, and it is kind of like waking up. You are in a very different headspace than normal reality. And so there's this kind of disconnect, this kind of insular, being just very invested. And so much of what is going on is really right up here. It becomes very much it's up in here in your brain. It becomes this very big, powerful head trip. And when you're in it, you do not recognize it at all, and it's really after you get out, it's from the outsider perspective that you can recognize a cult. You can take somebody who is in a cult and you can give them a checklist and you can say, these are the signs, these are the red flags and the indicators of what you should look for, and they will dismiss and justify and rationalize all of it, and they'll be like, they will not recognize themselves as being in a cult. It's only from the outside that you can really evaluate it more objectively and say, yeah, something is definitely off there.
I would say another characteristic that defines a cult rather than a mainstream religion would be employing cult tactics. Things like love bombing, things like restricting access to outside literature, things
right.
like
So
surrounding...
On the one hand, they tell you that you're the most wonderful person in the world and get you in that way, and then they also imply that everyone who's not part of the in-group is really evil and out to get you, right? So they sort of isolate you.
Yeah, there's social isolation.
And while they're telling you that you are so loved, that you are so important, so special, they're at the same time totally undermining your self-esteem and your individualism, and they are cutting you down to where you feel like, like lower than the earthworm, and so it's kind of this weird dynamic, and that's part of what makes it so hard to recognize when you're in it, is because you do feel super special, and at the same time, deep within, you feel absolutely worthless and absolutely dirty, and you have such a deep disconnect that it makes it very confusing. It's like being, basically in the twilight zone when you're in it.
Yeah. So I did say that this panel was about secular cults. So I think we've had a good introduction to what cults are in general. But we've got some specific examples of cults which are not necessarily overtly religious, although they can wind up touching on the religious a lot. And I think we're going to start with Karen's topic. Hi,
Sure.
Karen.
So we've been looking at some of the definitions for cults. So I think I should start with to provide a definition of the New Age. What is the New Age? So the New Age encompasses a really diverse array of theories and ideologies and beliefs and practices. And these are drawn from a wide range of different religions and philosophies and psychologies, self-help theories, and from science, pseudoscience, and also the paranormal. And that's just a few examples. So the New Age is religious-like or religion-like in many ways, but it doesn't have the traditional structure of organized religions, and I'll go into that shortly. But some examples of New Age groups include maybe spiritualism, the law of attraction, various kinds of alternative medicine, and again, those are just a few examples. So initially, I'd just like to talk about the ways in which the New Age is a type of secular cult. And I think that there are lots of parallels to cults, specifically within New Age groups. So if we look at the New Age groups and communities and movements and schools that have some kind of structure. So to begin with, a New Age group that would be a secular cult would have to have some kind of hierarchy, I think, within that group. So they don't have popes, they don't have priests, but they do have leaders. And these might be gurus, or they might be yogis, or they might be motivational mentors, or authors, or doctors, again, drawing from a wide range. And these groups, I think, would need to have followers as well to be classified as being a secular cult. And these people would tend to promote that group and to spread the fame of that group as well. So these groups might use special terminology, and I thought in particular of Scientology, how Dianetics has its own dictionary or two dictionaries, I think, of various terms that are specific to that group. Or they might repurpose existing language as well, creating new senses for words like quantum and vibration and frequency. We're very familiar with that. So these groups as well would claim to have some kind of specialist knowledge as well, that they appear to have insider information that they need to share with people, that there's some kind of conspiracy or cover-up for this information. And I was thinking in terms of Kevin Trudeau's What They Don't Want You to Know series and how he is with that. So I think for a group to be a cult as well, a New Age group to be a cult, it needs to have special theories or traditions or guidelines or schools of thought or systems, styles, pillars, all that sort of thing. So these aren't always immediately apparent too. Often they might be revealed to the follower once they've been involved for a long period of time. So these theories too are often unquestioned by followers, so there's no application of critical thinking. People just follow them blindly. And these groups are often unscientific as well, or they might even be actively anti-science. So they might blend science fiction with fringe science like the Raelians or Dianetics, and they might have the semblance of being scientific as well, but not actually be scientific. So like various alternative therapies which appear to be scientific on the surface. And these New Age groups...
Yeah, I know I've actually gotten readings from Scientologist groups before, and they have this wonderfully elaborate, you know, their e-meters are basically you put your hand on two bars and the needle swings depending on how much pressure you put on it. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And they pretend that this is super high tech.
Oh yeah, it's just reading your whether you're sweating, how stressed you are. These machines cost about $5,000 too. You can find them on eBay, but you've got to, if you're an auditor, then you need to have at least 2 of those. But I think we've all had encounters with Scientologists. Of course, they would call themselves a religious group, but we can argue that later on. So these New Age groups, I think that they're often insular as well. So they isolate and they segregate themselves from other people, and they do this not in the traditional way. It might be through a retreat instead, or a workshop, or a commune, and through hierarchies too, and through levels of membership of belonging to that group. And they also make miraculous claims too. They'll claim that they can cure disease and that they can improve your life, or that they hold secrets to the afterlife. And their knowledge is often not free, so it's something that you have to pay for. It can often be very expensive too. And people invest a lot of their money attending seminars and doing counselling, and I've heard of cases of people losing their entire life savings just belonging to a particular group. And often, like with the Scientologists, if you can't afford to pay for continued auditing, then maybe you can work for them instead, and they'll get their blood from you that way. So I would also end this section by saying that these groups are often dangerous and harmful, that people have been injured or they've even died as a result of their participation in them. So I thought I'd also look at some of the ways in which the New Age is not like a secular cult, just to be fair and to mark the differences. So as we can see, the New Age has its own special brand of dogma, but overall it doesn't have one doctrine. It doesn't have a single theology. The New Age is very broad. It can be fragmented. It can be very unstructured and too loose to really be called a cult. People simply can buy a book or they can attend a workshop and there's no further commitment that's required in any way. So the New Age as well can be considered a religion, or it can involve aspects of organized religion. Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism and Hinduism are often very popular to incorporate aspects of those religions, whether it's just symbols or terminology. And I think that the New Age is a kind of evolution of religion in a time of growing secularism. And so the New Age person, instead of believing in a god, they might believe in angels or in demons or aliens or ghosts or ascended masters and supreme beings and things like that. So but the New Age can also be compatible with atheism too, which I find very interesting. The New Age also promotes individuality rather than necessarily collectivism. So it can be a kind of do-it-yourself belief system that where people are encouraged to follow their own paths. So you've heard of a lot of the catchphrases that are out there, like Joseph Campbell's "Follow your bliss," and Sylvia Browne used to say, "Take what you like and leave the rest behind." So New Age is often seen as free spirit, so not necessarily someone who's conformist, but someone who does their own thing, pick and chooses what they want to believe in. So I really think ultimately that whether a New Age group could be considered a secular cult or not depends on the specific group that we're talking about. So I just want to touch upon a couple of examples of groups that I think are cult-like in their behavior. And so the first one is breatharianism. I don't know if you guys have heard of that before. It's also known as inedia. And it's the alleged ability to live on light rather than food. Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. So the major proponent is a woman called Jasmine Heen, and unfortunately, I'm sorry, she's Australian. Her name's Ellen Grieve, and she claims she hasn't eaten since 1993. She lives on pranic energy.
I want to interject here because I also discovered one of these gurus who says that you don't have to eat to live. And when I looked into him, he was offering these cruises that you could take with him and learn his secrets for like $10,000.
Wiley Brooks.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was the guy. It was some Indian guy, but.
Oh, okay. But Wiley Brooks is another major proponent, and he claims that he can offer the secrets to breatharianism for about $10 million. Go into the website. He also says,
yeah, because I mean, one of the characteristics of cults is they really are largely money-making scams in many cases, right?
Either money or narcissistic supply.
Uh-huh.
I think there are kind of two schools of cult leaders: the ones who are just raging megalomaniacs, like my grandmother, who was actually not very good at managing the business side, and the ones who are really in it for the money. I think that those are kind of the two primary motives, but I don't think that every cult leader has both equally.
Well, I think a woman like Jasmine Heen is doing this for the fame and for the attention. It's more of an egotistical thing. But yeah, she claims that she just lives on pranic energy, and she lives on cups of tea and the occasional piece of chocolate as well, because she's bored, not because she has to have it. So she really complains. She really says, and her followers say, that we don't need food for nourishment at all. We just eat for pleasure and for the taste and for the sensation of it, but we don't have to eat, which is a frightfully dangerous thing to promote. Yeah, she's a liar as well. She's a hypocrite. She has been caught. Some journalists were at her house and they found food in the cupboards and in the pantry, and she claimed it was for guests. A journalist was on a flight with her once too, and she was ordering the vegetarian option, but she said it wasn't for her. She was going to share it with someone else. So full of bullshit. But anyway, she was tested by 60 Minutes Australia, and they isolated her for about 4 days, and by the end of that period, her body was showing signs of distress. She was dying. So they basically stopped the test and didn't proceed any longer. But other people haven't been so lucky, because there have been about 5 deaths associated with breatharianism. And these people have isolated themselves from society and just followed the claims in her book and essentially died of starvation. So I would definitely describe that as being a New Age secular cult. No religion to it at all. So another example is Share International, and this is a UFO cult. I think these groups are interesting. You might have heard of other ones like Heaven's Gates. And
I lived like 45 minutes from the Heaven's Gate people. And now I live near Waco, so, I mean, well, within a couple hours.
Got to be careful.
Yeah.
And David Icke as well, he's another one of these people that believes in UFOs and aliens. So Share International, it's a UFO cult. They've got offices and they have followers across the world. And the leader, his name's Benjamin Krem, and he teaches a lot of pseudoscientific ideas. He says that we have space brothers and space sisters, and they come from Venus and from Mars, which sounds a bit like the, what's his name? David Gray or whatever. Women are from Venus and men are from Mars. But he claims that they visit us regularly. And the reason that they visit us is that they've got a spiritual mission to protect us from ourselves, to protect us from destroying the earth. And there is evidence for their existence too, and that is that there are UFO sightings all the time, and crop circles as well. That's proof that these space brothers and sisters exist.
Yeah.
And
we have a limited amount of time, so I was wondering maybe we could table some more of your examples and catch up with them at the end if there's more time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've gone overboard as per usual.
That's totally all right. But you mentioned earlier that some of these New Age groups are compatible even with atheism, and I think it's a good time to go even more extremely in that direction and talk about Adam's favorite subject. Hey, Adam.
Hey. So, I guess that's my cue. So I said I was going to talk about Ayn Rand and Objectivism.
It's going to be a little controversial. I know that whenever we try to talk about Objectivism on the show, we get hate mail off the butt.
Well, a lot of them are atheists, which is interesting. Like I said, it's a rare example of a cult that claimed to be built purely on reason and on rational argument. But for anyone who's not familiar with Ayn Rand, I'm going to start with a little bit of background on who she was. She was born in Russia in the early 20th century. She came from a prosperous upper-class family that lost most of its property in the Bolshevik Revolution and the subsequent formation of the Soviet Union, which gave her a sort of a lifelong sense of anger and resentment about that. In 1926, at the age of 21, she emigrated to America, where she embarked on a career as a screenwriter and then eventually as an author. She used her work to promote an individualist philosophy of her own invention, which she called Objectivism, and which was, in essence, basically just the exact opposite of communism. Everything that communists said, she said the opposite. Her two most famous novels, which propounded this philosophy as part of the plot, were The Fountainhead, which was published in 1943, and more significantly, Atlas Shrugged in 1957. So, Objectivism, as expressed through Rand's books, is a laissez-faire and ferociously pro-capitalism political philosophy. In Rand's view, a very small number of people are heroic geniuses whose productive powers keep the world moving and sustain human civilization. Most of the rest of humanity she dismissed under the epithet looters, which was her term for allegedly worthless, non-productive humans who can sustain themselves only by leeching from the rich through taxes and welfare programs and other oppressive laws and regulations. In Rand's view, Christianity, Buddhism, communism, socialism, and in fact basically all religious and political philosophies other than her own are devious inventions of looters trying to craft moral systems which explain why they have a right to steal from the deserving. And the only moral society, according to her, is one that lets the rich accumulate as much wealth and property as possible and do absolutely anything they want with it. In Rand's most famous novel, Atlas Shrugged, the world's business titans, mostly millionaire corporate executives led by a capitalist messiah named John Galt, are sick and tired of not getting the respect and indeed the worship they feel they deserve from the rest of us unworthy specimens. So to prove that humanity can't exist without them, they all retire from society and hide out in a secret enclave in the mountains of Colorado. Without their productive powers, society collapses into anarchy and millions of people starve. In Rand's view, this is a happy ending. And they intend to return only afterwards so that they can rebuild civilization out of the ruins in their own image. Now, although she was a lifelong atheist, Ayn Rand has become the patron saint of the American right. For instance, Alan Greenspan was a personal friend of hers and a former follower of hers. As chairman of the Federal Reserve, he put into practice her view that markets always do best without government intervention, leading, as he later admitted, to the housing bubble and spectacular subsequent crash of the late 2000s. Paul Ryan, the former Republican vice presidential candidate, said that he required all his staffers to read Atlas Shrugged, although he later backpedaled on that a bit when Rand's atheism became a liability. The Tea Party is made up mainly of Rand's intellectual descendants, as elderly white retirees on Medicare angrily threaten to go Galt and deny the rest of us their productive brilliance.
Yeah, I think I just want to say it's really funny because at least in the context of Ayn Rand's stories, the characters who went Galt by ditching society and letting it collapse without them were sort of supermen in the story who really were, basically running everything. But the people who say they're going to go Galt now are like, Glenn Beck, if anybody remembers him, was like, well, I'm going to stop doing my show, and that'll teach everybody.
That'll show you. So Rand rejected all religion, and she claimed that her objectivism was a philosophy derived purely from reason. Now, what it seems she meant by this was something like, because I am the most rational person alive, all my preferences are the correct preferences, and every person who calls himself rational should therefore desire the same things that I do. And this extended not just to politics or religion, but encompassed art, literature, music, fashion, interior design, even sexual preferences. In Rand's view, Rand's favorite composers, like Rachmaninoff was one she liked, were the correct composers, because she somehow inferred their music showed that they valued life and reason and capitalism the same way that she did. And those artists whom she thought didn't share her sense of life, like Beethoven or Rembrandt, she dismissed as ideologically wrong and declared that no true objectivist would like or appreciate them. And she expected anyone who called themselves a fan of hers to share all her tastes. It was a philosophy allegedly based on individualism that allowed no room whatsoever for individuality. You can see this in her novels as well, because all her heroes have the exact same set of beliefs, and all her villains have the exact same opposite set of beliefs. So as Rand became famous and accumulated admirers, this tended to lead to some very comical scenes. Many of them took up smoking because she smoked. There's a famous passage in Atlas Shrugged where she said it was rationally obligatory to smoke while you were thinking because it represents the productive power of fire tamed at man's fingertips. The real reason is probably just that she was addicted to tobacco. Women would show up at Rand's balls and dinner parties wearing the same gown as Atlas Shrugged's heroine, Dagny Taggart, which she wore in one famous scene of Atlas Shrugged.
They were cosplayers.
Basically, yes. But in spite of their strenuous efforts to imitate Rand's taste, very few of her followers were able to measure up to her exacting standards. Some of her devotees said that being around her was like walking on eggshells. A single mistake or a hostile question could get you labeled anti-life and permanently ostracized from her inner circle. For the longest time, Rand's chief acolyte was a man named Nathaniel Brandon. He was seemingly the only person that Rand truly liked and admired, and who she trusted to carry on her philosophy after her. But there was a problem, which is that in Rand's view of the world, sex is an expression of admiration for another person's philosophical ideals. I didn't make that up. And because she and Brandon were de facto the two most rational people on Earth, they therefore had to have sex, notwithstanding the fact that A, Rand was about 30 years older, I believe, and B, both of them were married to other people. Amazingly, both their spouses agreed to this for a while, allowed the two of them to have liaisons whenever they wanted. But when Rand discovered that Brandon, who was cheating on his wife with her, was also cheating on her by having sex with a much younger female objectivist, she exploded in anger and formally excommunicated him, which provoked a massive schism within the group of her followers. Rand's biographer Angie Heller called this period Stalinization, ironically enough, as she began to purge followers for more and more trivial slights. And it's ironic that she claimed to hate the Soviet Union and communism so much, but the atmosphere that prevailed in her cult during the later years of her life was very similar in some ways. There were Soviet-style loyalty oaths. She would explode unpredictably in anger when she felt people weren't showing her sufficient respect. And whenever she got tired of someone, she published formal notices of expulsion in her newsletter, The Objectivist. One of her former friends said, "One mistake was all it took to be drummed out for life." By the time Rand died in 1982, her inner circle had dwindled to a mere handful of people, and one of her last wishes was that she wanted guards posted at her funeral to keep ex-objectivists from attending, because she didn't feel they were worthy of paying their last respects to her. Objectivism still exists. You know, there's still a couple of the few followers who are left at the end still run the Objectivist Institute, and I think the book still has a much broader cultural influence. You know, I wouldn't say it's a formal cult the way it was during her life anymore, but a surprisingly large number of people still swear allegiance to her ideals.
I would also say that her book is used by other cult leaders, like the C Street cult, to support their own literature. That's actually often how my grandmother's books were used, was for even the smaller, more distant cults to support their own faith healing.
So aren't there a number of skeptics who see themselves as being objectivists? I'm wondering how they became involved in that.
Yeah, well, you know, I think there are things in her cult that skeptics would theoretically be drawn to. Like I said, she was very staunchly anti-religious. She claimed that they only believed in things that could be proven by reason. She very much hated and dismissed what she called mysticism, which basically amounted to all religions. And I'd say among the kind of libertarian right-wing faction of skeptics, there are a lot of people who adhere to her ideas to some degree or another.
Interesting. I have been neglecting to mention that we have a live chat going on, just like we have throughout all of or FtBCon, and people are free to ask questions to Lousy Canuck, and he will pass them on. And let's see, the URL for that, I believe, is tinyurl.org/FtBCon. So if you're not participating in that now, then hop on in.
tinyurl.com.
Yeah, tinyurl.com/FtBCon. And we have a question, but I think I will table that one until everybody has had a turn. So, Vyckie, you've got some things to say about homeschooling groups. Some homeschooling groups, presumably.
I do, and interestingly, you know, when we talk about secular cults, you know, my experience with homeschooling and the whole cult mentality was definitely rooted in the idealism of, you know, very fundamentalist Christianity. And so I don't have a lot of experience with secular homeschooling groups per se. Although peripherally, I've been watching, and I see this, and what I really want to kind of emphasize is this mentality. You know, you can have these checklists, and you can say this is what makes up a cult, but until you actually encounter these groups, and even, you know, having been a part of more than one of these kind of very insular, it's kind of hard to define, and like you said, it can be very vague, it can be very objective or subjective to say, well, this is definitely a cult. But I think one of the main things that, in my experience, really defines what is going on here. You know, there's this idealism, there's this whole, you know, you want to belong, you want to be, you know, somehow distinguish yourself from the group, and for the you know, basically the way that the world is, because you have so much of this idea that, you know, if you can be different, if you can do things better, if you can do things in a way that really isn't following, and it's really funny because you don't want to be following, you don't want to be a part of the, you know, the crowd, or the ones that just, you know, blindly, you know, do what society is dictating, and so you want to have this kind of intentional, deliberate, you know, we're going to do things differently. And it's very ironic to see how that mentality, that whole mindset of let's be different, let's not, you know, follow the crowd, let's not be, you know, mindless followers, it can very much lead to a situation where you have this group, and within the group, somehow the dynamics of it develops, and it's not always, you know, especially like within a homeschool group, or within, you know, there are many communities that I have been a part of that have been, you know, kind of countercultural, and like, you know, and Angie would know about the home birth movement, the natural birth, or, you know, Karen talked about the, you know, being involved in that alternative medicine, all of these kind of things where you're just wanting to, you know, not follow this, you know, standard, what everybody else, you know, is getting, the popular culture. And what happens within those groups then is that you kind of get this superiority complex, and you start getting this us versus them mentality, and you start feeling like, you know, those guys are just all, you know, what they're doing is the way that everybody does it, and we have this better way. And when you get into that, and I've seen this with homeschooling groups, and part of it is just this very much of an idealism where you just want to do better. You want to do it the right way. And it kind of becomes this black and white, this dualism, this very, you know, us versus them, as I mentioned. And when you get into that kind of mentality, it's very easy for this little slippery slope to happen, and the next thing you know, you kind of created your own little cult there, your own little following. And what makes it very very dangerous is just the fact that because you go into it with this idea that you know the red flags, that you know, it's kind of interesting, when I was a Christian, cult mentality was my topic. It was actually something that was very important to me. I was one of the founding members of the Cult Awareness Project in the state of Nebraska, and I would give lectures about how, you know, what constituted a cult mentality. And I remember when I was very young, I was involved in a kind of a strange situation where we were in Ukiah, California, and my stepfather started going to the People's Temple where Jim Jones was preaching, and I remember him coming back to the house one day, and he says, "You have got to hear this guy. He is just amazing. He is just, so dynamic." And so I went and I listened. I was like maybe 8 years old at the time, and it was, you could feel the presence. The whole thing was just like, wow, we are part of something that is not ordinary. It's something that is not, the basic, what the world is spoon feeding everybody and all these blind followers. But this is real. This is something that is just very intentional. And I remember feeling like, wow, this is the real deal. And some circumstances happened. We ended up moving away, because I remember at that time they were making plans to move out of the country, to move to Guyana. And my stepdad, he was like, "That's a great idea. We can just get out of here, start a new life." And we were kind of excited because it sounded all foreign and adventure and everything. But it didn't work out. We ended up moving away before that happened. And so then it was years later, I think I was around 13, 14 years old, when we saw on the news what happened with the People's Temple and Jim Jones in Guyana. And I remember just being shocked. I remember saying, how in the world does somebody in their head get to that point where they are so convinced that what they are doing is, that this leader, what they're telling them is true, that they're so completely convinced that they are willing to put poison in their children's mouths. And I remember being deeply affected by that and feeling like, I want to find out, first of all, I want to know how that happens. I want to know how I cannot have that happen to me. And so I did study cults. I did study all of that, and I had the checklist, and I had the how-tos and what to avoid and all of that. And yet, years down the road, I find myself in this situation where very much we had just fallen into it, and it was very much like the frog in the boiling water kind of thing. Is everybody else hearing that? Okay.
Hearing what?
I was hearing this buzzing. It's very distracting. But I guess my point is that it seems like there would be a very obvious way of being able to identify and say, yes, I am in a cult. But a lot of times it's not until after, and from retrospect and from, to be able to get a more objective look at it, because you could have never told me that I was involved in a cult while I was there. I didn't see it, and I would have argued with you. And I know Angie, would be able to really identify with this feeling too. That it's like, no, this is the right. What we're doing here is, perfectly logical. It's very consistent, and it makes sense. And this is good. This is wonderful. And so, yeah.
As far as homeschooling goes, I have a question, because I would never want to say that all parents who decide that the public school system or private school system isn't for them are cult members or anything, but there is kind of an element of, a large number of people when they choose to homeschool are doing so in a way that is sort of deliberately withdrawing their kids from contact with a wider society, and sort of retreating into a world where, are there sort of common core materials that are pushed out by any centralized homeschooling groups that some sets of homeschoolers follow, or anything like that?
Well, you make a good point, that because homeschooling is a commitment. It is something that is going to cost you something. Your time, your money, your energy, you are investing in this. And, in order for anybody to even consider that kind of lifestyle, they have to have that kind of ideological mindset in the first place. They have to believe that they're going to be able to do it better. that they, that this is the right way. Because if it's nothing different than what you can get from the public school, why bother? Why not just send your kids and you've got that free time in the day? You can get a job, make some extra money, or you can take a nap, whatever. so you definitely, there's a certain kind of personality type that is going to be attracted to homeschooling. And I know that there are people who are doing this for a secular reason, and they're saying, well, my public schools are not safe. They're not doing a good job. And so there are these other reasons why you might have a problem with the public school, but then when you do that, when you take that step to homeschool your own children, you're making an investment, and that is one of the key factors in becoming in this cult mindset, because once you invest your time and your energy and your mental processes, all of this, what's going to happen is because you are putting so much into it, your mind kind of plays this little game with you in which you find ways to convince yourself that it's worth it, that this is worth your investment. And so you will start to kind of play these little head trips with yourself, in which you find like confirmation bias to say, oh yes, this is right. And just the very thing of pulling your kids out of the public school system, the huge thing, and homeschoolers are very defensive about the whole socialization topic, and they'll say, well, my kids, they're getting opportunities to interact with other kids in this way, and they're being able to, interact with all age groups. They have, all of these explanations for why socialization is not really a problem. But it turns out that from a kid's perspective, we all start out, we all just naturally have this kind of feeling of not belonging, this desire to be a part of a group.
Besides socialization, which I've seen before from homeschooling advocates as them being resistant to this idea, I've also seen like a general trend where anything that a typical mom can't teach without a lot of special training tends to be just kind of dismissed as not that important.
Yes.
Like,
there's a lot of rationalization that goes on.
I mean, as a math and science guy, well, computer science specifically, I had the question, like, how do you handle teaching high school level math, where that touches on stuff like trigonometry and calculus that is a challenge for any average person to teach unless they're immersed in it. And the answer I tended to get was stuff like, well, you can find math everywhere, you can count change at the grocery store. And I'm like, well, that doesn't answer that question, does it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, by and large, it's either just not teaching some of the high-level skills, and that's true for people who grow up in secular or religious cults, that there are going to be some basic life skills that they're going to either be missing their high school diploma, or they might not know how to drive, or they might have no idea how to manage their own finances or apply for a job. They might not have a social security card or a birth certificate. So there's a lot of ways in which growing up in a cult sort of complicates things later on. And the homeschooling in particular is a big one, because there's all these huge education gaps.
Yeah, it kind of ropes people into a situation of dependency where they can't do basic life skills by themselves, so they have to rely on the group that has always provided stuff for them and said they love them so much.
You see that with the Amish and the fundamentalist Mormons, and I think that's why a lot of people, when they're given the option to leave if they want to, they refuse to. It's just a lot easier to become baptized and become a part of the community rather than have to face the world out there.
Right.
Especially so underprepared for the world out there.
I would say that, ironically, Ayn Rand followers have the opposite problem, which is that their cultic belief is that a true capitalist should be able to do literally anything they set their mind to. So, Rand herself said she could have been a composer, she could have been an engineer, she could have been anything she chose to. She just chose to be an author. And you see that in her novels, too, where all her heroes are these omnicompetent capitalists who can run any business equally well with equal brilliance. And I think that, has led to a lot of problems for real objectivists who find that they are not as good at that as the fictional characters in the book.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that reading your posts that you've done on Atlas Shrugged, it becomes very clear, painfully clear, that Ayn Rand herself doesn't really understand very, very basic things about running a business or metallurgy or stuff like that.
Right. Well, the climactic, MacGuffin that drives the book is that one of her heroes invents a perpetual motion machine, an engine that can run forever with no fuel, and then withholds it from the world because he doesn't think the world deserves it. Now, I'm not really clear on how Rand thought you could still have a capitalist economy with free energy. That seems like that would be more of a post-scarcity type economy.
All right. Anyone else want to weigh in on homeschooling some more, or shall we move on to my topic?
There's one other point that I want to make, and I think it's important to say that in pretty much any group of people that you put together, there is that potential to develop that cultic kind of relational way. When you are trying to control information, when you are trying to control ideas, when you have this us versus them mentality and this whole, we are going to do it the right way kind of thing, you can fall into it. And it doesn't matter your purposes of why you get into it, but I think a lot of it is the dynamics of the relationship. And when you have a controlling person, when you have someone who wants to manipulate and somebody who wants to, basically prove their superiority, then you have the potential for any group. I mean, I've seen it happen with online groups, support groups. We're talking about survivor groups. We're talking about people who actually have come out of cults and who have said, I've lived through this, and yet the next thing you know, they've got this group going, and the same dynamic is happening all over again. And yes, we've scrapped the religion, we've scrapped, whatever ideology of, we're not going to do home births anymore. We know the dangers of being anti-vaccine, and yet within that group, over time, it can develop to this point where you've got an authoritarian person, you've got this hierarchy, you've got this whole dynamic going on, where the next thing you know, you're like, dang, we're right back where we were. And it can be very frustrating. But my point is that you just can't relax about it. You can't just say, okay, I've got this figured out, and it's not going to happen to me, because it does happen to a lot of people, and you don't. There aren't road signs that say you are here. It's a very gradual thing, and before you know it, you've fallen for it.
Yeah.
I do want to make one point about ideological purity that really plays off of what Vyckie was just saying about, you might start, homeschooling because you're not happy with the local community, or you might decide to try for a natural birth because you've always been in good health, or whatever it is. You might start with a very sort of gateway reason, an entry reason. I'm going to nurse my child because it's slightly better. Well, then that becomes, as you fall into these special interest groups that are all about this one topic, whether it's the right way to parent or the right way to give birth or the right way to homeschool or whatever, it starts this creep of ideological purity where suddenly you have to be like, and it jumps in very big progressions sometimes. So it's both creeps and jumps, that you'll start with, something rather normal and just slightly atypical, and then it builds and builds until your life looks nothing like a normal life anymore.
Well, yeah, because cults, by isolating people, kind of subject them to extreme confirmation bias, right? Where everything that they believe is right, and any outsiders who question them are just inherently wrong because they're not part of that in-group. And so you can go way off into the weeds when you cut yourself off from any outside opinion from people who would be likely to tell you, hey, whoa there, slow down there, that sounds a little nuts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and that ideological purity, I think, happens in a lot of movements that aren't specifically cults, where it's a little grayer, but I think that's one of the things to look out for if you find yourself being pushed to further and further extremes of something in order to maintain your position in a group. That's probably not a good group to stay in.
We've got about 20 minutes left, and we still need time for a Q&A, so I'm going to talk about my topic, but I'm going to try to restrict myself to about 10 minutes. Let's see. So when I was in college, I was getting close to graduating, and I was a little anxious about what I was going to do with my life, and I got shanghaied by this guy in a store who was pitching this business idea, and he was looking for people to join his business, and I'm going to use very elaborate air quotes on that. And it turned out that he was trying to represent this group called Amway, which has been around, I think it started somewhere around the 60s, but Amway is one of a whole bunch of groups that is part of what's referred to as network marketing or multi-level marketing. And as I discovered when I started getting into this, the basic idea was that Amway would sell products, some of which they manufactured and some of which were just resales that were supposedly discounts. And they would say that you could always save money by buying their products, and you could also recruit other people to join this group. And every time you make a sale to one of those people, or one of these people makes a sale on their own, you wind up getting a cut. And so what this wound up being was that they would draw all these diagrams showing exponential growth in income, which would continue to last even if you stopped actively working the business yourself, because you would have this little army of people under you who you had recruited, and they would make you lots of money. When I got into this group, one of the first things that this guy wanted me to do, and I should clarify, I didn't get into the group. I was tempted by this offer, and then I started reading more about it from critical sites, and I was like, no way, this sounds like a terrible idea. But one of the first things that this guy tried to get me into was I went to a couple of meetings where people would sit around and they would listen to this speaker that I'd never heard of, although, I mean, they would bring in these motivational speakers and people who had been super successful in the business. And these guys would talk about how incredibly rich Amway had made them. And they would not only talk about the wealth that was coming at you inevitably because you're such a brilliant person and there's the love bombing going on, but also that all other ways of making money are crap and dead ends. There's a common acronym among not only Amway but a lot of other network marketers, which is JOB. That if you have a job, then you are just over broke. That is their term for it. And they say, well, you can't rely on investing because the markets could crash any time, and if you continue working your whole life, you're a sucker because as soon as you stop working, you stop making money, and you can't start your own business because 90% of all small businesses fail. But with Amway, and only with Amway, you can become incredibly successful. And they would rope people into these businesses that really mathematically made no sense because they're basically selling junk with which has to get these massive markups because you're adding layers and layers and layers of middlemen who are all expecting a cut. But as soon as people start getting discouraged, they would go back to these meetings where motivational speakers would tell you what a winner you are and how you're gonna be one of the people who strikes it incredibly rich, which doesn't jive with reality because when you look at the statistics of how much people make through Amway or any other network marketing scheme, they're abysmal. So the average Amway IBO, independent business owner, which is what they call themselves, the average active IBO, and that accounts for like less than half of all people who get into Amway in the first place, make an average of, I think it's $200 a month. And they paint a rosy picture of that, treating it as, well, that's just residual income, and it's going to grow and grow and grow, and meanwhile you can work your regular job. But it turns out selling is really hard work. And when you math this out, basically, you find it's for almost everybody what you get back from Amway is way, way, way below minimum wage. But you do wind up buying a lot of products, so you most likely spend more than that $200 a month just to stay in Amway. And all these meetings aren't free either. So when you go to a seminar, it can cost you like 10, 20, 50 bucks plus travel expenses if it's a big trip somewhere. And then when you're there, they also try to push on you motivational books and tapes that you can listen to, which will reinforce the idea that you're a winner and you're bound to be rich. And they have like cute little pet phrases to describe outsiders, things like stinkin' thinkin'. And they will ridicule and denigrate anybody who does not understand the Amway opportunity. And in fact, the first web page I ever really wrote was negative stuff about Amway, and I got an amazing amount of email with, hate mail with all kinds of speculation about what a failure I am destined to be. And since I've been so interested in Amway for such a long time, that was kind of the motivation for this panel in the first place, because it made me realize that people get very, very tribal over something like a business opportunity that is bad for most people, and they use this kind of positive reinforcement to justify to themselves things that don't work out or don't stand up to any kind of serious scrutiny.
Can I ask you a question, Russell?
Sure.
Because I had some experience with Amway too, and I just wonder if you can describe the feelings that you have, because there's so much pressure, to recruit other people and to, kind of like in evangelicalism, you have to go out and witness, but in Amway, you need to sign somebody up. And so I'm just wondering if you could describe that feeling that you had, where like part of you doesn't, like, no, I don't want to do this, but at the same time, and how that rationalization works.
Well, I'm not the best person in the world to describe what it feels like to be a true believer, because I grew up non-religious, and I only flirted with the idea of getting into Amway before I realized that it absolutely wasn't a good idea for anybody in general. But I've talked to a lot of people who have been involved in Amway, and they describe getting out of the group as waking up and realizing that for years and years they've been lying to themselves and trying to justify all this sunk cost that they've already put in of trying to make this thing work for them. And, something like 0.1%, just to throw out a number, do strike it rich. But if that's 1 in 1,000 people, that 1 in 1,000 people are standing up on stage at these rallies, and they are the people who are telling you, well, look at me, I did Amway and I'm rich. And so people don't game out the actual numbers because it's easy to find like 100 people who are super rich, and then people tell themselves, well, I'm a winner, I can do this, and then since very, very few of them are actually successful at any point, they feel really bad about themselves and need that positive reinforcement that the group offers to keep from getting majorly depressed, I think.
I think what's interesting about it is when you're required to recruit, new people under your line of profits, or when you're required to evangelize, witness to other people, it's like that is something that it goes so against our natural instincts to, reach out and to say, here's what you got to do, and you're drawing these people in, and what it forces you to do is this whole head trip thing. I talked about the mindset, the mentality. You got this head trip going where you have to convince yourself as much as you have to convince that person that you're trying to convince. And so it's that reinforcement that really brings it home to you and makes you really think, yes. You might go into it, you might be just kind of worried, yeah, I'm going to, see if I can get my sister to join because she might be interested. But when you're explaining it to her and when you're trying to get her into that, like your brain is doing things to yourself. And by the time you're done, you're like, yeah, this is a great idea.
Right. We have only about 10 minutes left to take some questions, so I think we're going to have to be a little rapid fire about it. And our first question, I'm not sure can be handled briefly, but it is a slightly trolly question, but it's a good question because we're going to get asked this sort of thing in the comments. I mean, right now, I can see a bunch of people posting in comments. I mean, I can visualize them posting, it's super ironic that we're talking about cults because Free Thought Blogs is sponsoring this convention, and that's a huge cult. Or, to put it more generally, atheists who are sort of, to use the favorite term, social justice warriors and interested in dealing with racism and sexism. So I'm the only actual free thought blogger here, I think, but we've got
I'm not really very heavily involved with you guys at all, but I think we could say the same thing about skepticism, really, that it's a movement, that it's a community, that there's an unquestioning following of its leaders. There's this kind of othering and this us and them attitude. It can be very insular. We've got our own terminology, so we can really turn that back on any of these groups, any of these opposing groups.
I agree with Karen. I specifically think, though, that within the atheist or secular communities, I would say that there are a few leaders that I personally consider people to watch out for. This will probably be the most controversial thing I say, but I think James Randi has kind of a slavish following that does not meet up with how honest he's always been.
Charismatic leader that's characteristic of cults.
Cult of personality. He's got his own annual convention every year. I also think Sam Harris, as he explores some of these more new age and less verifiable claims, as he becomes interested in writing about spirituality, I think he's the one to kind of watch out for.
Yeah, I will say, though, that in skepticism in general, there are some people who kind of hero worship individuals, but I think that at least in the skeptical community, there is often at least as much pushback
That's the ideal.
like trying to cut down these people who are becoming big figures.
I think that's the ideal.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure that that's where we're really at, but I think it's what we we aim for.
Maybe. Anybody here worship PZ Myers? I gotta say, I'm a big fan of PZ Myers' blog. I like a lot of what he said. I thought he was kind of a douche when he told me that it was wrong to fixate on Robin Williams being dead and not be sad about it. But I'm okay with that. Everybody is kind of a douche sometimes, and that's how I approach not being cultish about anything. Any more on that question? We can move on to another one. We've got a question specifically for Adam. It says, I've seen that one of the major objectivist groups denies relativity in quantum mechanics as irrational. Do you know if Ayn Rand had any opinion of relativity or quantum mechanics?
Yeah, well, if she's ever written about relativity or quantum mechanics, I have not heard it. And I've read a lot of what she's written. I've read a lot of biographies of her. Somewhat surprisingly, Rand talked about contemporary science very little. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that in objectivism, all knowledge is basically assumed to be a priori. That if you have the correct rational view of the world, you can just figure stuff out. And science is not real. Scientific method is not really that important. And you kind of see this in the book because all her super capitalists have these brilliant new inventions that just come out of nowhere. Like I said, I don't know if she ever actually addressed relativity or quantum mechanics. She did talk about evolution, somewhat surprisingly, and she said something like, I don't know if I support... She said, I have not studied the theory of evolution, so I don't know. I am neither a supporter nor an opponent. And I think a lot of these scientific theories made her a little bit uneasy because it's a tenet of her philosophy that the human mind is just a purely rational, blank slate, computer machine type reasoning engine. And the idea that human beings might have instincts or subconscious impulses or drives inherited from our predecessors was something that was very unsettling to her. Mm-hmm. So she tended to steer clear of avoiding these issues that had dangerous philosophical implications for her. Relativity and quantum mechanics somewhat partake of that same problem. Like the question said, I believe the Ayn Rand Institute has had prominent people who have said that these are Kantian science and therefore not reliable because they deny objective reality.
So basically, it's that confirmation bias all over again. If I'm super rational and I don't understand quantum mechanics, then quantum mechanics must be nonsense because a rational person like me can't just know about it.
Right, exactly. And she also felt that human beings could effectively create their own reality through pure willpower, as in the book where one of her heroes invents a perpetual motion machine because he loves capitalism just that much.
Yeah. Looks like we've got one last question, unless I'm overlooking something, and that means that it's almost perfect timing to wrap this up in a few minutes. I'm very proud of myself. Although I feel like this is something we've already discussed, are there signs you can identify if you think the organizations you're involved with are cult-like?
Absolutely.
Good one for, yeah, Angie, go for it.
Absolutely. Clear hierarchy, which obviously does not on its own make a cult, but it's one of the things to look for. Also, love bombing. Physical isolation through the use of retreats and getaways. Having lots of group literature and specifically denigrating any out-group literature, trying to control access to information, limiting people in your life, like trying to get rid of any non-believers in your life is a big one to watch out for. And any group that promises to offer special knowledge that cannot be obtained without membership in that group.
Saying take the red pill seems to be really common among a certain mindset of people, right? In reference to the Matrix. Anybody else have anything to say as we're wrapping up? And Karen, I'm really sorry that you're the only one I interrupted. I just was worried about timing.
That's okay. Some other time.
I would like to just add, I think it's an important thing to just evaluate constantly. Don't feel like you're immune. Don't think that, the group that you're involved with, because they have secular values or because they don't have a specific agenda or whatever, that they're they're safe and you're fine, because really it can happen, and when it does happen, it's not anything that people just obviously recognize immediately. It's something that you need to, constantly be saying to yourself, follow your intuition and follow your heart, and say, but then also think to, does this even make sense? Why, if you're feeling that there's some discomfort there, that there's some, controlling, or that you're just, you're afraid to speak your own mind, to say, I have this different opinion or whatever, then stop and say, why is this? Why is it that, in this crowd, I'm not very willing to just speak out and say, here's what I think.
Yeah.
And if that's how you feel, then you need to stop and say, what's going on here?
I always think that the first principle of skepticism is to always remember, first and foremost, to be skeptical of yourself and what you think. And with that, we got to go. You guys have been such fabulous panelists. I'm so glad that we got to do this. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Good night.